with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. And I am really pleased today to have Jordan Haedtler with us for this webinar on how is climate change affecting our investments. Jordan is a climate financial policy consultant, and he has broad experience both as a legislative aide at the federal level and at the state level. In fact, I met Jordan because he was tracking and instigating green bank policy in several states across the country last year. And so when MNIPL was involved in starting what became the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority, he introduced himself and with the groups he was working with, and he became a really valuable a person in that effort because he had relationships with our bill author and he had really deep experience on how green banks work around the country. So thank you for all you did to support that effort, Jordan. The Climate Innovation Finance Authority just met yesterday again, so it's moving along and doing great things. But you also have of this climate finance experience is covering a number of different avenues that we're going to be talking about today, some of which led to more policy efforts by MNIPL and allied organizations in the past session, and I'm sure it's setting the stage for things we're going to do here. So I will turn this over to Jordan in a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to center us in the land acknowledgement that we give at the beginning of all of our meetings. And if you'd like to close your eyes or however you'd like to receive this, please do. And I will share it with us now. Wherever you may be, let us acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous land. Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and the community members from these nations as we pursue a right path together. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country. The land we reside on came under control of the USA through genocide, slavery, and ongoing occupation. We recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted Indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. By offering this acknowledgement of trauma, we affirm the right of people to bring their whole selves and stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love. Thank you. Thank you. And now, Jordan, I'd love to turn it over to you. And it appears that I need to unmute you.
Yes. Okay, I was just able to unmute. All right, so let's get the slides back up. Thank you for that introduction and acknowledgement, Sarah. And so let's get started. So I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on climate as a threat to financial stability and how climate change is really beginning to affect our overall financial system. And this has major implications for our retirement savings, for all of our investments, and also for the risk of another sort of 2008-like crash. So let's, begin at a very high level. And we'll talk about how federal financial agencies have started to understand and incorporate climate change into the work that they do to regulate the financial system. And to do that, we first need to define a couple of key terms. So broadly, the risks that are defined by regulators are typically grouped into two major categories, and those are physical risks and transition risks. So to understand how climate change causes those risks to grow, um, you look at the ways that climate change is increasing those risks. And when it comes to physical risks, these are the ways that damages from floods, wildfires, a drought, and other climate impacts are causing higher economic losses. So a business or a home may have to pay out increasing damages, and state governments, federal governments are being exposed to major losses. The banking system and all of the financial institutions, including most notably insurance companies, are exposed directly to those risks, and the losses that they sustain can be transmitted to the broader financial system. So that's physical risks. That's pretty straightforward, just direct losses and exposures to these climate disasters as they get increasingly more extreme and more serious. And then on the other side, you have transition risks. And transition risks are understood as assets that have a high likelihood of declining in value over time because of climate change. And so these are typically understood as fossil fuel assets that either because we move to a policy framework that winds down those assets and shift up investments in clean energy will decline in value. But that's not the only way that transition risk can manifest itself. There's also shifts in consumer preferences, rapid technological changes and advancements that can make clean energy deployment even more attractive and make fossil fuel investment even less cost effective. Um, and so there are numerous ways that the fundamentals of the fossil fuel industry and oil and gas, coal assets that have produced returns for investors for many decades um, are becoming more shaky, and the risks of continuing to invest in them are becoming less financially beneficial. And shortly after President Biden took office in 2021, he directed Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and the members of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is often called FSOC. And that was a new agency of federal financial regulators who lead the Treasury Department, the Fed, the OCC, the SEC, other financial regulatory agencies. It was created after the 2008 crisis through Dodd-Frank, and Biden directed the FSOC to begin studying climate change as a potential threat to financial stability for all the reasons that I just discussed. That study was released in October of 2021, and it found indeed that climate change is an emerging and increasing threat to America's financial system. And shortly thereafter, all of the agencies who sit on the FSOC began taking steps to require disclosure of climate risk. The SEC just finalized a few months ago a climate risk disclosure rule that requires publicly traded companies regulated by the SEC to disclose some of their climate risk that they're exposed to in order to better inform investors of the long-term implications that climate has for this company that they're investing in. And the Fed and FDIC, other banking agencies have since put in place guidance that basically affirms some of some of these definitions of climate risk that I just mentioned, and begins to institute a sort of regulatory framework for what to do about it. I want to highlight in particular one agency that sits at the FSOC and advises them, which is a subset of the Treasury Department called the Federal Insurance Office. Now, the Federal Insurance Office only has the power really to collect data. They're not a regulator. Because insurance is regulated entirely by state governments, but they have really sounded the alarm, and Janet Yellen has echoed some of the things that the Federal Insurance Office has said about how insurance is proving to be a really major channel for climate risk spreading throughout the financial system. Last year, the Federal Insurance Office published a list of 20 policy recommendations for how state policymakers, most especially state insurance regulators, but also state legislators, to integrate climate risk into how they regulate state-based insurance companies. And they also have issued a data collection that seeks to get a better grip on how insurance companies have been affected by the growing damages and payouts from these increasingly costly climate disasters that we're seeing, not just in California and Florida and other coastal states, although that's been the bulk of the media attention on this issue, but also in Midwestern states, including Minnesota. And our Minnesota House Commerce Committee held a hearing on that subject in February. Some of you may have read that the Star Tribune just published an editorial on that topic last week. So insurance is one major way that states exercise economic power and have a lot of authority to give us a better understanding and to regulate the entities that are creating this climate risk and spreading it throughout the financial system. But they also have a lot of economic power to determine the course of what happens next with the state of climate finance. And that's because, state governments have they make major fiscal investments. They have huge fiscal power through their use of state budgets. The collective value of state budgets is $2.7 trillion in spending annually. States issue debt and are participants in the bond market. That's a $4.1 trillion bond market. But then most relevant to this conversation, public workers and state workers contribute to pension funds that are managed by state public pension fund managers, and the value of those pensions is over $6 trillion throughout the country. So it's a major economic player, and state public pension funds are some of the most important institutional investors in the entire economy. What that means is that all of those assets that are invested in workers' retirement security are invested in the stock market, and companies, publicly traded companies, including fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, but also including big tech firms like Google and Microsoft, have a significant number of their shares controlled by public pension fund managers. And through them, the shareholders that are workers like you and I. And so public pension funds actually wield a lot of control at the annual corporate shareholder seasons that take place every spring. And this power to effectuate corporate decision making through wielding public pension funds vote on during proxy shareholder season is known as proxy voting, and it can really affect how corporations govern themselves. They elect and re-elect their board of directors at these shareholder meetings. They also vote on a series of shareholder resolutions that can be about any number of questions related to racial justice, to climate action, and so on and so forth. And just a few years ago, ExxonMobil replaced one of its directors with some directors who were more supportive of climate action and shifting some of the company's investments, expanding them toward a slight scaling up of clean energy. And they didn't do this voluntarily. They did this because their shareholders demanded it through shareholder action. So that's the kind of power that states as institutional investors can have, but it's rarely power that is exercised, and a lot of states have traditionally delegated that power to some of the largest asset managers who manage public pension funds. The big three are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. So recognizing that these state governments and state public pension funds are very relevant to a number of corporate decisions, including corporate actions on climate. The Heritage Foundation, which many of you may know as the driving force behind Project 2025, which is very much in the news right now, began construing an attack a few years back on environmental, social, and governance investing. This is sometimes called socially responsible investing, or ESG. And ESG is really a risk analysis methodology wherein investors are informed about the various factors, environmental, social, and governance, that should be taken into account when determining the long-term value of a company. And ESG can be very valuable in determining what is and is not a smart long-term investment. But there's been a very well orchestrated campaign over the last 3 to 4 years to construe ESG risk analysis as, quote, woke capitalism. And this campaign, which you may have seen presidential candidates and organizations like Heritage promoting, has largely been waged so far at the state governmental level. State treasurers and state legislators have passed, at this point, 19 states have passed a combination of, I think the number is like 70 or 72 laws that in various ways restrict how public pension fund managers can take ESG factors into account when investing in state workers' funds. And these laws have proven very costly everywhere that they've been adopted. They are raising the cost of borrowing for states and cities. And relevant to Minnesota, 5 versions of these model bills have actually been introduced by members of the minority party in the Minnesota legislature. And not only are these laws having an effect on how workers pension funds are managed in the states where they've been adopted and are raising costs for state governments everywhere that they've been adopted. But they're also having probably the biggest intended effect of all, which is to really chill activity during that spring shareholder season. So this is an analysis of uh, shareholder proposals related to ESG questions, including climate change. And you can see that the support for them has been declining in no small part because uh, there's been a lot of rhetoric against ESG, and these state laws are actually changing how state governments can participate in those, and more importantly, they're causing BlackRock and State Street and the other big institutional investors to sort of withdraw from some of the actions and statements that they were making about ESG previously. So I think there have been some questions in the chat. Uh, Before I move on to what we've been doing about this problem, I might just pause and see if there have been any questions.
Thanks. I think that's a good moment to invite questions into the chat. And I'll just give it 10 more seconds in case anything's on its way. Thank you. Jordan, would it be appropriate for me to put that Pleiades strategy report from 2024 in the chat?
Yeah. So this is my colleagues at Pleiades Strategies have been tracking the laws and their effects and some of the opposition that they've drawn, not just from labor organizations and environmental organizations, but also from business associations, state banking associations, et cetera. There was a major trend, very a big flurry of activity in 2023. There were two additional states that hadn't passed a tax on ESG in 2023 who passed a tax on ESG this year. Those were Georgia and South Carolina. But there was a big drop in the level of support and the level of activity that we saw this year as compared to last year. But nonetheless, despite the modest decline in state governmental activity, we're still seeing this as a big national campaign, as evidenced by the Project 2025 mentions of ESG. There are 40 mentions of ESG in the Project 2025 document. There's also 37 mentions of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and those terms are often lumped together by their adversaries as some sort of conspiracy to inflict or promote values using corporate decision making and financial markets, even though, as I mentioned, there's plenty of evidence that ESG investing does promote good returns and can be core to a strategy of trying to preserve those returns. And an example that Mike Frericks, who's the treasurer for the state of Illinois, likes to use is that Purdue Pharma, which was the driving force behind the opioid crisis, looked very profitable for a very long time. But as states and other actors began suing Purdue Pharma for their role in the opioid crisis, it bankrupted Purdue Pharma. And because Illinois used ESG principles to determine that Purdue was exposed to high liability risks, they pared back their investments in Purdue Pharma and thus protected their workers from exposure to the major decline in Purdue's value that came from their bankruptcy. Were there any other questions, or should I go on?
I think you can go on. Thank you.
Okay. So the last slide showed how there's been a very intense flurry of activity attacking ESG. There really hasn't been that much on the other side, sort of promoting legislative proposals to protect pension funds from climate and other systemic risks. Uh, there have been a few instances of actions. They've all been a little bit, they've had some shortcomings, as I'll discuss a little bit later. Illinois last year passed a bill called the Sustainable Investing Act. And all that did was really define the sustainable investment principles that Illinois expects private pension fund managers who are responsible for overseeing Illinois workers' pension resources, um, expects them to adhere to, and puts in place an annual disclosure process for making sure that Vanguard and BlackRock and some of the other asset managers that Illinois employs are not retreating, as many of them seemingly are in the face of all of this onslaught. Colorado and Maryland have both passed laws that require a climate risk assessment of the state's investment portfolio. So they are looking at some of these questions of how the long-term investment assets that they're making are implicated by climate change. And then in Washington state and here in Minnesota, there have been bills that seek to strengthen pension fund management risk. And although neither of them have passed, they have fostered action on other fronts, as I'll discuss. I'll describe the details of the one that MNIPL was involved with, which was Senate File 4859. This was introduced by Senator Sandy Pappas, who's a longtime member of the Joint Legislative Commission on Pensions and Retirement here in Minnesota. And the overall summary of the bill that Pappas introduced is that it basically codifies or lists out the various systemic risk factors that the Minnesota State Board of Investment should consider when making investments with Minnesota workers' money. It, like Maryland and Colorado, also requires a regularly updated climate risk assessment of the overall investment portfolio. And then finally, it aligns Minnesota's proxy voting practices with 1.5C climate targets. So what does that mean? It means that Minnesota would have to take into account whether proposed actions at the shareholder meetings of all of the companies that the State Board of Investment is invested in are aligned with climate targets that the state is committed to. So if whether there are directors that are up for election or re-election who have been understood as obstacles to more aggressive climate action, or there are shareholder resolutions urging different climate or environmental practices, the SBI, State Board of Investment, would be obligated to vote in favor of climate action where relevant. And so this bill didn't move in this 2024 session, but it was a discussion point for engagement with a number of Minnesota state legislators and just as crucially, with the 4 elected officials who sit on the State Board of Investment. And those are Governor Tim Walz, Secretary of State Steve Simon, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and State Auditor Julie Blaha. And we met with all four of these SBI members and their staff and engaged with them on the principles, the reasoning behind why Senator Pappas had introduced this legislation. And in those meetings, we heard a lot about the climate roadmap that the State Board of Investment has been contracting with a firm called Makeda to produce. And they announced this 2 years ago that they were going to put a climate roadmap out there that recognized that climate is producing some challenges and um, creating these risks for pension fund members, and that sort of produced a plan for how the State Board of Investment is going to shift its investment strategy to recognize that changing landscape. And probably a lot of people on this call have been meeting with the State Board of Investment for years now and urging stronger action, had been asking where this roadmap was. They announced, 2 years ago now that they were going to put it out. But by the time that the legislative session began in January of this year, it still wasn't out. And just after the legislative session wrapped up, and after we'd had all of these meetings, on May 21st, the State Board of Investment met and approved this climate roadmap. And so we think that while all of the content may have been under development for quite some time, the action and the long promised action may have been prompted by some of the legislative activity that we were fostering. The climate roadmap, first and foremost, clarifies that that State Board of Investment and the investment staff who work for the SBI look at all factors and take into consideration all risks that are material to the long-term health of the pension fund. So while they didn't get as specific and didn't expressly define what those climate risks are and how they're affecting these investments, it was seen as a pretty clear recognition that there are many other states that are moving in a different direction and are specifically directing their pension fund managers to rule out certain factors when making decisions about workers' pension funds. And then there was a commitment to steering $200 million toward energy transition investments. I'll get into the details a little bit later about that. And then there was a pledge to support proxy committee efforts to engage portfolio companies. Now, the executive director of State Board of Investment during this meeting, she gave a lot of voice to the importance of proxy voting, and she recognized that the SBI, with over $60 billion of investments, has a lot of weight in some of these shareholder discussions. And this is often mentioned as a reason why the SBI can't divest altogether from fossil fuels or other controversial activities, because the SBI is an important seat at the table, and according to SBI staff, it's important for them to use their voice. And they've given examples of where they did use their voice, and it did result in a change in corporate policy. The ExxonMobil director vote that I mentioned a few minutes ago is something that Minnesota was, along with other states, on the right side of. and it's often cited as an example of how states are using their investments to steer corporate action. But there are major limitations to how expansively they are changing their proxy voting guidelines and aligning their proxy voting practices with the realities of how quickly and dramatically climate action needs to be taken over the next decade. And so, to give just one example, SBI, among other most public pension funds, has really only been looking at how their proxy voting practices apply to major oil and gas companies and other big fossil fuel companies. And they don't really consider non-fossil fuel companies to be relevant to whatever standards they apply to proxy voting. So even though Wells Fargo, for instance, is a globally systemic important bank that remains a major driver of fossil fuel underwriting and is actively supporting a lot of fossil fuel investment, and has, like other big banks, made commitments to phase out their fossil fuel investing and achieve a net zero by 2050. There have been shareholder resolutions calling on Wells Fargo and other big banks to exactly specify how they intend to reach their net zero targets and to quantify how they're going to shift their investments to achieve those net zero goals. And Minnesota, and along with most other public pension funds, has voted against those shareholder resolutions. And the reason given is that banks, insurance companies, big tech firms, some of the major companies that MSBI's retirement assets are invested in are not directly relevant to these climate goals. So there's still a lot of specificity and strengthening that needs to be done, in my view, to reform how the State Board of Investment is using its proxy voting power. But that is an area of engagement that I'm really encouraged by, because all of the SBI members and staff that we have met with are very clear-eyed that this is an area where Minnesota has a lot of power. And so while the roadmap that was approved in May doesn't give a lot of details, the fact that this process was initiated and that they are explicitly committing to continuing to strengthen their approach on proxy committee efforts is a really key area for engagement going forward. And on that subject, I just wanted to describe some of the shortcomings of other states' efforts, because the State Board of Investment, after approving this climate roadmap, has basically promoted its action as an example of where Minnesota is exerting national leadership. And I have to say, I think that is unfortunately largely true. There really aren't a lot of states that have taken a ton of leadership on this subject. One state that has, and was just a little bit ahead of Minnesota, is Maryland. And Maryland actually used the same firm, the consulting firm and investment firm, Makita, that Minnesota has used for its own climate roadmap. And the 2024 climate risk assessment that Makita produced for Maryland was published back in February, and it was not very good. It looked at a number of scenarios and found that even 3 degrees of warming would not really affect Maryland's pension fund all that much, and that there would only be modest damage. And so that's a curious finding in light of how pronounced the climate risk warnings from experts and regulators have been in recent years. And if you dig into the model that Makita used to produce that finding, you can see that there are glaring problems that reflect an overall flaw in the economics profession, which tends to dramatically understate the costs from climate change. And if you're curious, I can share a more detailed critique, but just to give one example of how these sorts of flawed models and data sets are being produced, they take variables like temperature into account, but they're just one variable. There's also other variables like agriculture and energy prices, and those variables are in isolation from each other. And so we know that energy prices and agriculture prices are hugely affected by warmer temperatures and by climate change. And we have every reason to expect that the price changes and the supply chain issues that we've seen from the pandemic, yes, but also from the floods and wildfires and storms of the past several years, has majorly affected commodity prices and agricultural prices. And that is not taken into account under the model that Makita used for Maryland, because they're not interrelated. So yes, they consider temperature, but they don't consider temperature to be affecting agriculture. And that's just an obvious thing that needs to be corrected so that we can get a more realistic assessment of how exposed we are to climate risk going forward. This is, again, another area that's rich for engagement because Minnesota is using this same firm. And so I'd like to, close by inviting a few questions and also saying that, I've shared with you all what I think are some key areas where we can begin to engage the State Board of Investment for next steps. And I hope to hear from all of you about what you think some of the potential could be. So I'll stop sharing now and just go into the question portion.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I'm seeing in the chat that this has been a wealth of information, and it's familiar on some fronts to some people, and it's brand new to others. So I think I muted you all. I didn't mean to do that, but if you are able to indicate in the chat if you want to come off mute for a question, that'd be great. And Jordan, I'll start off with the first question. You mentioned this briefly in the beginning about the way insurance markets are feeling effects from climate risks. And I think we're all seeing that in our own neighborhoods with insurance rates that increase. Sometimes messages from insurance companies about really big infrastructure projects that need to be undertaken in order to continue to maintain coverage and those kinds of things. I'm wondering what kinds of what are the big issues you see with insurance coming up as we understand what's happening in various other states? What do you know about what we should be on the lookout for here?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's something that I've written a lot about. I'll put some links in the chat with some of the overviews that I've written, but climate change is causing dramatic increases in payouts from climate disasters. And that is causing insurance markets all over the country to start to dysfunction. Insurance companies are raising premium rates very dramatically. In some states, there's a proposed doubling of rates in just a single year. North Carolina is actually considering a proposed doubling of premium rates just in this year. And certain high-profile companies are announcing they'll no longer be writing policies in states with serious climate impacts. California and Florida have gotten the bulk of the media attention, and that's where a lot of the withdrawals that have been reported from State Farm and Nationwide and Allstate and some of the largest property insurers have happened. But there's actually quite a lot of evidence that as serious as the long-term forecasts for wildfires and hurricanes are, actually some of the most immediate storms and catastrophic damage costs to big insurance companies the past few years have been from wind and hailstorms. And it was noted in the Minnesota House Commerce Committee hearing that took place on this topic in February that Minnesota ranked second to California in extreme weather damages in 2022. And so Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, these are no exception to this trend. We've seen hail and storms and flooding really go up, and it's causing really big premium spikes. What we haven't seen quite so often, which is reflected in the media coverage, is companies pulling out of Minnesota altogether. But the Minnesota the Minnesota Commerce Department, which is the state's regulator of insurance companies, has affirmed that consumers are really dealing with this, and there have been big complaints and premium spikes throughout the state. And so that's the overview. Did you want me to speak to like what we can do about it, or
Well, now that you gave us that teaser, yes, I do. What can we do about that?
Well, so it's going to take a lot of investment. And the most important thing to recognize is where Minnesota's moving in the right direction, which is refreshing because a lot of states aren't taking this action. But the Minnesota legislature approved, and the Commerce Department has begun setting up what's called the Strengthen Minnesota Homes program. Now, that hasn't launched yet, but it is a grant program that is meant to support Minnesotans with climate resilient investments and ways that they can basically fortify their home against these growing climate impacts. And Minnesota is also one of just two states that has a rule in place that mandates that insurers are required to give discounts on premiums to policyholders that have pursued these investments either on their own or through this new program that's still being set up. And so that's really great news. And I hope that these programs and rules are as successful as possible. But there are other states that have implemented roof fortification programs. And in California, there's also been this rule mandating discounts. And what we've seen is that it really hasn't helped the market as much as one might hope. And so there really needs to, because, it can cost $14,000 or more to fortify your roof and harden your home against climate disasters. And so a small monthly discount um, on your insurance policy isn't necessarily the best incentive. Um, so these programs need to be strengthened, they need to be expanded, and they also need to be joined with regulatory changes like the one that I mentioned. So I'll put in the chat also the Federal Insurance Office uh, published a report recommending 20 different policies that states could enact to make sure that insurance companies are measuring their risk to climate change, that they are remaining well capitalized so that they are positioned to pay out damages to policyholders and not just abandon people who have insured their homes. And that's important not just because we don't want to continue to see all of these consumer hazards, but because when insurance companies become insolvent, their assets are held by banks and hedge funds and other important parts of the financial system. And so that's what Janet Yellen has been warning about, is that this really has implications for the whole financial system and could cause like a 2008 like crash.
Well, great. On that note, uh, not great. But Dan Vogel had a question in the chat. It said, I've heard that the number of deaths from heat exceeds deaths from other climate causes, but heat deaths are not eligible for FEMI funds. Are you looking into the impacts of heat to the costs of the climate disaster?
Yeah, I think Dan means FEMA, Federal Emergency
FEMA?
Management
Okay.
Association. I don't know about that specific issue, but I do know that extreme heat is a problem that is growing. I'll also put in the chat when I get a moment here a extreme heat index and extreme heat resources page that the Department of Health and Human Services recently deployed that is meant to support state and local governments in addressing extreme heat, because there are these gaps where state governments may get federal support for disaster aid in the wake of a hurricane or a wildfire, but they aren't always dealing with some of the major challenges that we're seeing every summer now all over the country. And with respect to FEMA and the disaster relief that FEMA manages, um, there just aren't enough resources. Even the federal government is having trouble completely fulfilling the huge needs that states and cities have as climate disasters get worse. And the dysfunction of Congress has not helped. The Maui wildfires last year happened right at the moment that there were these big debt ceiling and government shutdown negotiations. And so ultimately, Congress did approve funding, but it was a few months after it was really necessary. And Massachusetts had some severe flooding last fall, and FEMA actually denied assistance, not because the flooding hadn't been bad, but because there just weren't enough federal resources available. And so both Massachusetts and Hawaii in the last few months have proposed setting up these disaster resiliency funds, because it's a sad state of affairs, but states are really having to take matters into their own hands because the problem is becoming so large, but also it doesn't help that the federal government is not very functional. And while you're asking the next question, I'm just going to put some of these things that I've referenced into the chat.
Great. And we will be sure to capture those and put them out and put them in the follow-up email that we'll send out in the next couple days. Thanks, Jordan. I think there's just time for one question. We have one more question. We have a couple in the chat, but we will get answers to those and send that out with resources too. We just have 2 minutes left. And the question from Tess is, what could be the most effective path to make sure SBI is considering climate and ESG when it comes to investments that aren't explicitly fossil fuels like Wells Fargo, et cetera? Is it realistic that they'll shift themselves and codify those changes? Is there legislation that would address or influence this? Thank you, Tess.
Thanks. Great question. So the I'll put also in the chat, Sierra Club earlier this year put out a report that really specified the specific votes that public pension funds have been making, and it focused on the financial sector. And the thing that I mentioned about how most public pension funds don't consider financial institutions to be relevant to the climate standards is directly what I've been told, not from Minnesota investment staff, but from other state investment staff conversations. And so there's every reason to expect that we can change this just by engaging them and by showing them the statements and actions that financial regulators have been taking, that would suggest that, the Federal Reserve considers the financial sector to be material to climate. So why shouldn't pension fund managers? And then, yes, Senator Pappas's legislation would address that because it requires all of the investments to be aligned with a 1.5C climate target. But we can also look to refine the legislation coming out of the engagement and conversations that we have with SBI staff.
Thank you so much. It's been a real gift to be able to work with you on some of these really complicated issues. I really appreciate the understandability you bring and the direction you bring. It's time to close out. Thank you for your time today. If Sam's able to share the QR code through a screen share here, we ask you to support this work that Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light is doing on the ground in Minnesota, in the policy realm, and also face-to-face with our neighbors. You're integral to that success. And we appreciate you being on this journey with us through this summer policy series. We have one more on building better that's coming in August, and you will see notices about that coming out, how we build better in Minnesota. Incredible thanks to Jordan Haedtler for your contributions today, your presentation, and we'll follow up with resources. Enjoy a beautiful day.
Thanks, everyone.